Kia ora te whare. Kia ora tātou I hui mai nei I raro I te whakaaro hohunu o tēnei huihuinga. Te kaupapa e kia nei, orite I te whakaaro hohunu o tētahi o ngā wahine tō mai te waka o Tainui a te puia. Ko tāna hia e kia nei, me tū pakari ai ngā whakatipuranga o te ao Māori I runga tēnei moe a. Kei te oho au I te pua waitanga o taku moe a. Ka huri au ki tērā o ngā reo, ko tautoko au I te mihi ki kingi hūtei tūheitia me ana kāhui nui o te kingitanga, anei te mokopuna hoki o Pikiao I tautoko ana I taua tuāhuatanga. Kāre hia kia rōrua ngā mihi, ka huri atu au kia koe turi o maunga pōhatu o ngā tūhoi Jason. Kei te mihi atu ki a koe mō te whakaaro hohunu, rangatira, me whai whakaaro tātou I rungo I te manaakitanga o te rungarawa, me ngā whakaaro hoki I te whanaungatanga o tētahi ki tētahi. Aha ko ngō wai koe, aha ko ngō hea koe, aha ko no iwi take ke, no te ao Pākehā hoki, kei te tautoko au I tērā o ngā mihi. I te rangatira I pupuri te mauri o tēnei whenua rangatira o Ngāti Wairere, kei te mihi atu au e te pāpara na aha ko, kei te haere atu koe, kei te pai ki te whakaaro hia, ki te whakarongo hoki I o kōrero e pāna I te mana Māori motu hake o te iwi o Tainui. Ana tēnā tātou katoa. I just felt inspired by the previous speaker to remind us that the inspiration of rangatahi has long been something that has been uppermost in everyone's mind, I think, from generation after generation. And certainly one of the whakatauki that inspires me every day is something that the late Eva Ricard reminded me of when we were on the My March, the march against the Multilateral Agreement on Investment. And it was getting pretty rough at that stage. We were escorted basically from the top of the North Island right through to where we ended up in Wellington by a convoy of policemen, and we were all under surveillance by the Threat Assessment Unit and the SIS at that time. And when we went past Ngārawahia, she reminded me then that Te Puia had inspired a generation and that her greatest dream was to awaken to the blossoming of those dreams of that generation. And listening to the earlier speaker, I think her plea for us to be included in the strategies is nothing new. I don't think it's being ignored, but I think one of the key questions that I would posit is that are we being asked to lead our own philosophies? Are we being asked to lead the philosophies of our ancestors? Or are we being asked to go into a global straitjacket determined by a neoliberal framework which of itself will undermine the identity of us as Indigenous peoples? And we need to be very, very cautious as young people and as, I think, as descendants of people like Eva Ricard and Te Puia to take on carte blanche the lollies that might be on offer from some of these institutes that we visit, and actually substitute the values that they are promoting for the values of our own people, which are much, much more linked to our mother, Papa Tuanuku, which have a history and a recognition of their own understandings that guide our philosophical constructs of tikanga Māori and Māori law and philosophy, and actually also set limits and boundaries of the way we can exploit or use our mother to benefit for profit. And one of the things that I think I want to highlight in my address today, which has been set out in the, is this history, because it's been a long history. I came from Tunahopu Marae last week, where I was representing Sir Bom Gillies, one of my uncles, and he was on the My March with us too. There was only about 40 of us, so I was one of the really clear that some of the leadership in our world, and it's nearly 40 years ago when we were doing that, were actually inspired about protecting our cultural and intellectual integrity in a whole range of attacks in that period. It was a time, that March, when the treaty was under attack with the fiscal envelope policy. It was a time when Te Tiriti rights were also being recognised for the first time within Pākehā law, but within the straitjacket of Pākehā law. So I want to just, remember that there's context to this hui. It's a 40-year context, some say, of struggle. I say it's of education. It's been a real important part of struggle to educate the kāwanatanga of their obligations in the founding documents of He Whakaputanga and Te Tiriti. And sometimes that kāwanatanga has resisted that education to promote its own goals of colonisation and imperialism, which are very much part of any free trade agenda if we look at our history. I have to say, though, who would have guessed that the Crown or MFAT would be funding a hui on Indigenous self-determination and the CPTPP? That hasn't been my experience when we've even asked for a koha, even at Wānanga. So I see that certainly that they've started to open their pockets. It might be because we have influential leaders in places that are able to allow that to happen. The fact it's happening, though, is a testament to decades of pressure from Māori to be heard in the international trade arena, and I feel very privileged today to have those amongst us here today, like Maui Solomon. We're doing a book launch for Moana Jackson at Otaki on Friday, and I also want to remember Nāneko Minhinik and all of her struggles from the peoples of her people are around the protection of all of the things that free trade agreements want to exploit. Straight after this hui, I'm going down to the conference to honour Moana. I think, manawa tia matariki, it's really important in the season of matariki that star puhutakawa and those that have gone before are remembered. And so I want him to be deep and central and sitting amongst us, as his wairua obviously is, as you meet and consider some of the challenges and ideas that will be put forward to you over the next 2 days. It was him and the late Dao Wihongi and Te Pere Curtis from Te Arawa who first rang the alarm about how international free trade agreements could trample Te Tiriti in 1990. After they attended an Indigenous intellectual property conference in New York to exchange experiences with other Indigenous peoples. Soon after that, the first international conference on the cultural and intellectual property rights of Indigenous peoples was held at Whakatane Aotearoa. Aroha Meads is not here today, but we should actually pay homage to her efforts for that particular kaupapa. They signed the Mātātua Declaration on Cultural and Intellectual Property Rights of Indigenous Peoples, which was presented at the UN as part of the International Decade of Indigenous Peoples. The Y262 claim, and Maui and Leo Watson are part of the lawyers that were arguing that, and we're still around, we still survived, despite the fact that they put that in the cobwebs for a long time, with a number of leading advocates, some who've passed on, and the Y262 must be seen as an integral part of understanding Te Tiriti obligations in the current context we face. It was lodged in 1995, highlighted the threat to mātauranga from the proposed TRIPS agreement at the World Trade Organization. How many of you know that there was an amendment to the bill to adopt the WTO that would have prevented the Crown acting in a manner that is inconsistent with the principles of the treaty, that was moved by the Honourable New Zealand First Tau Henare? It was lost by just 2 votes, 42 votes to 40. So if we got that through, we might have been in a different, this place a lot sooner than we are, and we might be in a different place than this space as well, in terms of our ability to develop our own systems of trade. Of course, today we know better than referring to the principles, although I'm really pleased to see that the National Build Environments Act is now going to have to give effect to Te Tiriti, not the treaty and its principles. Big win there for those of us that have been fighting for that, but they still hell-bent on ensuring that there's this vague reference to treaty principles from the Crown discourse. It's really important that we remember these origins. Those Māori who spoke about free trade agreements weren't interested in lower tariffs or bigger export shares for their capitalist corporations. They were driven by Te Tiriti and its obligations, our founding obligations to the modern state of New Zealand, Aotearoa. After we had that, we had protests against the ADB, the Asian Development Bank Conference. You might not know, but I got charged with sedition for opposing development projects like dams that destroyed whenua, kāinga and the identity of Indigenous peoples across Asia. I just come back from a hui in Thailand prior to this Asian Development Bank. For those of you who don't know it, I also was educated in Singapore. I was the head girl at the United World College of Southeast Asia. So I'm very aware of how the World Bank and the Asian Development Bank have actually deprived and decimated Indigenous communities in the name of development. It's something that has certainly shaped my thinking, and I was very young. I was 17, for the young people here, just want to know really clear. And those experiences made me an activist, not someone necessarily that was unconsciously promoting a development agenda that wasn't developed by ourselves. There was a mobilisation against the multilateral agreement on investment. I think that was really important. My first taste of that was at the Tuna Hopu Hui in Rotorua, where they tried to keep me out, and Uncle Bob had led the protest of, most of us were in the Halter Racist Tours movement during the 1981 protests. I think Tūrero was on the other side in that battle, promoting rugby, a lot of people, but in our tribe there was a group called Te Kotahitanga o Wairiki, which had Sid Jackson, Hannah Jackson, and a number of communist trade leaders like Tame Iti and Willie Wilson, and we were still around when these things were still being promoted through the multilateral agreement at Tunahopu, which was my first experience. We were protesting that we wanted to give foreign investors guaranteed rights we don't have as Māori. So that's what the multilateral agreement, they were prioritising the right of exploitation of our resources that Māori were in court fighting for, like water, which we still are, so that they could actually have their development strategies for promotion of profits for multinational corporations, while the fledgling treaty settlement arrangements had not actually crystallised at that time and were just starting to on their way. Opposition to new pro-corporate services rules in the World Trade Organization that locked in neoliberalism, where Helen's Clark feet were held to the fire on national radio. I mean, I don't know if you young ones even listen to radio anymore. I think it might be a distant memory for even some of the older ones listening here. I know that that's the era that I grew up with, no television where my grandmother lived. And so national radio was our essential link to the outside world. And when I say the outside world, that was from Tapuai Hareru to Rotorua. Now you guys are on a different kind of link at the moment from here to Indigenous nations around the world. But those local understanding, those local philosophies still are really important to keep in mind. There were protests against APEC in Auckland in 1999. Challenges to the Singapore-New Zealand Free Trade Agreement saw the emergence of the Treaty of Waitangi Exception Clause that the Crown is still rolling over today. So we've got an exception clause that asks certain aspects of the treaty to be considered, very weak, diluted clause. It's the same clause that was introduced in the Singapore Free Trade Agreement that the Crown wants to hold on today. And, you know, one of the biggest challenges is, the world's moved on in the last 40 years, even though you want to straitjacket us to a mindset that invisibilises or diminishes treaty rights. Maui Solomon continued the battle Moana had begun over the trips in Y262. In 2007, I acted for Te Waka Kaiora in an urgency hearing in Y262. Jessica Hutchins is here. Angeline Greensall was from Tainui. They were trying to do what they did last week with the rongoa inclusion into their Therapeutic Products Act. We managed to lose in the tribunal, but they took the struggle to the streets and got it out then. So maybe, Donna, we need to take the struggle on the streets now to get rongoa out of the current bill. It was a really important kaupapa because the Australia-New Zealand Therapeutic Products Authority that threatened our rights and duties over rongoa were actually going to be the ones that would make decisions about use, for example, of the Indigenous biodiversity of Te Uruwera. It struggles me how Australians can do that when I doubt whether they've ever been there. But of course, they've already pinched Mānuka this year, so anything's possible once they can get their hands on the ideas that they can profit from the stealing and theft of our intellectual property. The whakapapa and the need to protect our rangatiratanga and tikanga is what brought my clients to the Waitangi Tribunal in 2015. So our whānau from Wanganui wasn't yesterday. I've been here since 2015. It's been a long 8 years. I just want to say that, and it's been a hard battle, and it's been resisted at every level by the biggest resources that MFAT could throw against us. And I just want to say that, because I work on legal aid. I get about $123 an hour. I do everything on legal aid. And I don't have this bevy or army of officials behind me helping us. It's just people that understand the struggle for the recognition of Te Tiriti and are prepared to give up valuable time with their whānau to fight for our rights. My Y2522 claimants were all veterans of the battles for tino rangatiratanga. Moana Jackson, Angeline Greensall, Hone Harawira, Robert Pauwhare, Paparangi Reid, Rikirangi Gage, and Moana Manipoto, who was always with us. I have to honour Moana. A lot of the others fell off, Hone went politicking. Rikirangi decided that he had to work at home and try and do his tribal settlement, although he was on my case all the time because he was really worried about the exploitation of our waiata and of our kupu and of how that could actually be detrimental to him. And he was also very concerned about the ecological environments in Te Taiao being exploited in the fisheries context of export and in the denial of water rights to enable the cultivation of particular vegetables, vegetation, not for sale, but to feed our own communities as a priority before we look at export. Another 5 group of claimants came in, so guaranteed that, everyone talks about Ngāpuhi kōwhaorau, but I love them because they are there, every one of them fighting with us on all of these take, because the whakaputunga and Te Tiriti is so important to them. Ngāti Hine, Ngāti Kāhui, Te Waimate, Taiamai, Te Whai Harawira, she was there right through the battle, as old and grumpy as she can ever be, and as undiplomatic as she always is. She was there right till the end. And, a lot of these people have passed on, like Moana and Te Whai. And I just want you to bring them in the room, because I wonder how many of you actually know the struggle and the people that were involved. And they are vilified every day in the media. And I'm not too sure in some of the lectures that I've been involved in, whether they are respected for the actual value they had as philosophical futurists for the protection of our rights. The claim went on for 5 years through 3 hearings and a mediation. We could only choose 4 issues, which were engagement, secrecy, plant variety rights, and Māori digital sovereignty. There were lots of other issues left out, including the rest of the Y262 issues. Investor guarantees, ISDS, health, Te Taiao and the climate crisis, and so many more. Because the tribunal's resources are also limited by the Crown people. They only have a budget every year. Their budget is not as great as other judicial resources and other courts. So we were invited to only focus to those 4 issues. I'm not going to go into the details of the tribunal reports here. I mean, they're really turgid reading. You need to kind of have a few days, so you read a chapter, have a moi, and then read again. It's turgid reading. But if you are a child of Te Tiriti, it's reading that is really valuable to educate you on some of the issues that we're confronting here. You can find more information, and now I'm doing a big plug for Ngā Toki Whakarururanga. I'm proudly a member of that rōpū. I keep hearing about this Te Taumata, but I haven't said too much written about the things they do. But come to our website, everybody. You see lots of PR on Te Taumata about Indigenous trade. Come to Ngā Toki Whakarururanga, and you will see the deconstruction of that imagery, of that myth, and to actually look at some of the underpinnings of those matters. I want to summarise by saying that the Crown got out of jail free in 2015 in the initial hearing process under urgency on the 2001 Treaty Exception Clause I spoke about earlier from Singapore. They were still negotiating the TPPA, and not even tribunal members were allowed to see the text. So this is stupid. I'm doing a court case about something that even the tribunal, who's meant to be a legitimate voice of law in this country, even though it's only got recommendatory obligations or abilities, they couldn't even see the text. That's how secret all these things happen. And you have to start under, I'm sorry, kei te huna kōrero, hea te kaupapa. Kei te raweke, koe nei te whakaaro. So for those that don't speak Māori, I'm just saying when you hide what you're speaking, you're up to no good. That's how I'm thinking, okay? The tribunal struggled to get their heads around the complex legal arguments and kicked for touch with the finding that the exception, and this is good, was likely to provide a reasonable degree of protection of the kind the Crown intends, but a stronger version should be discussed in the future. The Crown also survived the challenge over a Y262 issue on plant varieties, relying on a protection Māori had no role in drafting and still say is inadequate. But the Crown fell at the last hurdle on digital. So all you digital sovereignty activists, kia ora. If Potawa was here from Native Academy, Digital Academy, you have my love and regard. That's young people standing up and making a stand. He was our star witness for this case. So we do use young people. The old people don't know what this digital stuff is. So you have to kind of come to a new, different kind of generation to actually get the stuff across, okay? The tribunal found the e-commerce chapter in the TPPA breached the Crown's Te Tiriti obligations to protect Mātauranga Māori at the heart of Māori identity. Despite the treaty exception clause and a raft of other exceptions, they argued, that chapter, and this is why I'm not a fan of TPPA or CPTPPA, it's still in there. So I'm hoping this conference is asking them to change that clause, because if we can domestically start to change our laws, like the Resource Management Act to the new one, then why can't we do this for free trade agreements? Why should international agreements actually not follow the domestic trend of obligations? And really it's about educating, because Māori already know what should be the proper approach. The other two issues, engagement and secrecy, went to mediation. Long story short, the mediation agreement from October 2021 provides for the establishment of Ngā Toki Whakarururanga. Now, can I say this term is really important to keep as long as it is, because everyone started calling us the axes, Ngā Toki. It's actually a manoeuvre that was used in battle at Ohaiawai by the peoples of Ngāpuhi. And it was given to us after consideration by Dick Dargaville and Tiriti Wai and Peter Tipene. So it's a hugely important name. It's about protecting, it's about a manoeuvre. And of course, the toki is the wero, te ariro, to make people honest and true to the obligations of whakaputanga and te tiriti. The kaupapa and mandate of ngā toki whakaruranga are to uphold the rangatiratanga o ngā hapu. You know, all of these PSG people sitting here, sorry people, rights and interests, if you read the first line and the preamble to Te Tiriti, doesn't mention iwi, ki ngā rangatira, ki ngā hapu. Kei he noa atu te iwi. Kei raro i te whakaro Pākehā, ko te iwi, i roto i te Tiriti o Waitangi, he kupu mo tau iwi. Koina. It is also around affirming he whakaputanga o te rangatiratanga o New Tiriti and Te Tiriti o Waitangi to ensure the Crown is acting in a Te Tiriti compliant manner in relation to trade policies and agreements. The next 2 years after that mediation have had their ups and downs as the Crown has had to come to grips with what a Te Tiriti, not the treaty, a Te Tiriti relationship means. And ngā tuku whakarururanga remembers that the Crown has the resources, the information and the power. You know, they still threaten to take me to court every time I start writing bullshit letters, okay? I wonder what would Matua Moana Jackson say about where we are today. I'm sure we'll discuss that at this hui on Friday, which brings us to today. This year, New Zealand is chair of the CPTPP Commission, the peak body of the 11 CPTPP parties, soon to include the UK, our coloniser. The CPTPP came into force in December 2018. The TPP required a review of the economic relationship and partnership between the parties within 3 years. That was delayed due to COVID, but the 11 countries are likely to decide its terms of reference at their hui in Tāmaki on Matariki weekend. They can also consider any proposal to amend or modify the agreement. Consensus to change an agreement once it has been made is hard to achieve. Don't we know it? Singapore 2001, Waikato 2023, no change. That doesn't mean we shouldn't try. You know, if I'd given up trying, you wouldn't have half of the things that you've got now that the surfboard riders from the Māori Business Roundtable are suddenly exploiting. The fishery settlement, I was there at the beginning. Te reo Māori, I was the first Māori woman to go into the Waitangi Tribunal, and I was that argued for it to be an official language. So the Māori Broadcasting Agency, the 21 radio stations and Māori television were all parts of our efforts. I didn't get paid for that case. That was all done by myself and the late Rawiri Rangitauira, sleeping on the floor at Waifetu. So when the odds are against you, you don't give up or you decide, oh, it's easier to do something else. You actually look for an internal fortitude and you dream about what you can do and then you action it. You don't just talk about it. There's a lot of talkers in the sovereignty movement, but you've actually got to be an activist to actually activate that talk to substantial change. And that's where our international solidarity with iwi taketake from around the world becomes fundamental. Concerted Indigenous solidarity and mobilisations can shift the ground. Remember the TPPA march in Auckland? When we had Waka Huia leading the march and Ngāti Whātua and 40,000 people walked down Queen Street? They thought that we could never do that, but we did it. Remember the fiscal envelope marches that we had? That's the stuff that we can do when we are single-minded in our efforts to protect Te Tiriti and he whakaputanga. And remember that also many of us have been involved in struggles since then that haven't had the mobilisation of that, but are still equally important in the lives of our whānau around te reo and mātauranga Māori. So I'm asking us today to consider what is the Indigenous solidarity and mobilisations we're going to take from this conference to effect real change in these matters. A second review is also underway. Oh, gosh, I have to mention him. When Trump took the US out of the TPPA, remember that man Trump, okay? We can't forget him, okay? I understand he's arrested. I don't know if I want to be in the same term as arrest with him, but never mind, okay? And the remainder rescued it as the CPTPP. So we had TPPA, and they rebranded it, okay? So it's still the TPPA for me. It's just got this new CP, and I'm still trying to find a good sarcastic term for the CP. They add on to the TPPA. Communist Party, TPPA, but that would be an insult to the Communist Party, okay? They tried to rebrand it as progressive because it was so unpopular. New Zealand, Canada and Chile also made a joint declaration at the fostering of inclusive progressive trade, which promised to set up an inclusive trade action group. This is one of those grab bags of women, tino rangatiratanga mana Māori motuhake, mana wahine, Indigenous peoples, SMEs, labour, environment, and review its activities after 3 years. MFAT has just done that review. It was going to have a works program. It's no surprise that nothing has actually been done under the Indigenous people's part. So is that guilt why they're funding this hui? Or is this the tick-the-box exercise? So just keep this in your mind when you're talking to the MFAT officials. Engage with them and ask them, is this the tick-the-box aspect of their kōrero? Ngā Tuki Whakarururanga prepared a detailed input into New Zealand's 3 year of the CPTPP. I'm serious, if your children or students or activists or even business managers, you must go to our website. It's one of the most educational fora for understanding these many developments and the microaggressions in Crown policy that is happening right across the government. A summary is available, but a memorandum has been prepared by us that says these things. We can't forget rangatiratanga and Indigenous self-determination. There must be compliance with Te Tiriti Wai obligations to Māori in the TPPA and the CPTPP in terms of Treaty of Waitangi exception, which I've talked about, taonga species that I've talked about, digital, climate crisis. Remember, we couldn't do all of these ones, so they're back on the table. Natural resources, mātauranga Māori and kaitiakitanga, hua parakore and genetic modification. Remember, we're hearing parties now trying to actually take away the legislation for genetic engineering that we fought to ensure that we would have a genetic engineered free Pacific and a nuclear free Pacific. Waipiro, alcohol and rongoa, and a kaupapa Māori approach to assessing the economic impacts of the CPTPP for Māori. This confirmed our belief that the TPPA, CPTPP fails to provide effective protections for Māori rights, interests, duties and responsibilities under Te Tiriti and He Whakaputanga. And I've done a table on this, so to make it 101 simple, because Te Tiriti can actually make you go to sleep and boring if you actually have all of this stuff. So if you go to the FOMA website, they've actually put up a really good table on what are the rights and interests and duties and responsibilities under Te Tiriti, and we actually, a footnote in that, I did that as part of the Te Taikaha group. It's one of the best tables. I use it all the time when I lecture. But, you know, for those of us struggling to understand that, it's another important tool in our toolbox for challenge. As we have noted in kōrero and submissions to MFAT over the past few years, there are present and real risks to Māori and Indigenous peoples generally. You know, I don't know if you've been down the East Coast since January, but the climate change existential crisis is alive for us. I don't know if you've been to Lake Rotoaira Forest Trust or Lake Taupo Forest Trust. They lost a third of their forests in all of this. You know, this is real. And we've got to actually start to look at what's happening to plan actually sustainable futures to actually protect Papa Tuanuku in this part of the planet. The current approach to the negotiation of free trade agreements, including the TPPA, CPTPP, is almost exclusively commercially driven, even though their scope now is much broader. So we are starting to make changes, but it's very incremental. The focus is still on profit. Our worldview and perspectives on these matters are crucial to bring a much needed and unique balance to these discussions and negotiations. That is why it is important for Māori Indigenous peoples to have a seat and a voice around the negotiating table. We can't have the kāwanatanga talking for us all the time. as much as we love the Māori Party and the Green Party and every other Māori that's in Parliament, they are there under the veil of kāwanatanga. That is why it is important that we actually sit down, work out amongst ourselves what Te Tiriti promised Māori, how do we give effect to the Article 2 obligations, te tino rangatiratanga, me o rātou taonga katoa, me o rātou nei kāinga. What does that actually mean when we're talking about free trade? And what are the trade-offs to those things that are happening if you're not considering that uppermost in your mind? We were really realistic that that kind of change doesn't happen overnight, just like Te Puia was realistic. You know, she awoken to the blossoming of her dreams, and this generation will provide that blossoming for her. But we also have to remember Moana Jackson's warning against confusing incrementalism against transformation. Recognising the limitations of the ITAG review to address these fundamental issues, this is another one on our page if you're not savvy with some of the acronyms from MFAT. We have recommended a number of interim steps towards Te Tiriti compliance that we urge the Crown to take in relation to the CPTPP. These and many other ideas are bound to come up in the next 2 days. And my question to the Crown officials, and I'm not too sure if you got here, I think the plane has interfered, so Rangi Nui and Tāwhiri Mātea have meant that you're not allowed to listen to this, okay? But I'm hoping that you will listen to us and that we can urge you to take some interim steps in relation to the CPTPP to take account of these concerns. And it's not just an Annette Sykes concern. You know, they can actually diminish me to that rabid activist that all she does is make claims that can't be justified by data. We have made the claims justified, but they still don't listen because they have an agenda of neoliberalism that's actually embedded in the deep colonial and capitalistic histories that actually have taken our rights away in this country. But we do see some changes. I have to say that, you know, if it was Kiritapu Allen and Penny Henare in the Resource Management Act that have made these changes, then it's good to see those changes. But will the Crown as a whole be committed? And this isn't just the government. I'm talking about Crown officials, because I believe the law is now making Crown officials and even judicial officials, if we look at cases like Alice, having to think carefully about how they give effect to Te Tiriti when they make decisions. And we have to ask them, are they going to help us push this through? And then you have to ask yourself, because I'm there over 60 now, if they aren't going to do it, have we got a generation that is courageous and foreseeing as we were? And are you prepared to mobilise your communities out to the streets and actually make the Te Tiriti obligations actually mean something for the future of Aotearoa New Zealand? God forbid, well, I have to go back to the tribunal. I just about live there, I think, you know. I don't want to do that. But we must find alternative strategies of resolution, because I'm frustrated as hell, notwithstanding the 35 years of gains that I've just outlined. And I am committed to the vision in Te Mateku Mai of genuine transformation of this country that actually has constitutional change as promised. So all of the Māori in the room, that's the first question Moana Jackson would have asked you. Are you a Māori committed to Te Tiriti? Or are you a Māori committed to exploiting Te Tiriti? Kia ora.